When Japanese Imperial General Staff dismissed American supply capabilities as hopelessly inadequate for sustained Pacific operations, they could not foresee that within 18 months, American truck drivers would be moving more tonnage daily across a single supply route than the entire Japanese military transported across their Pacific empire in a month. The convoy system they mocked as primitive and inefficient would become the iron lifeline that strangled Japan's strategic position across the Pacific theater, delivering victory 1 ton at a time through methods Japanese planners considered beneath serious military consideration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. August 15, 1943. Imperial Japanese Army General Headquarters, Tokyo, Japan. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff for Operations, presented the comprehensive intelligence assessment of American logistical capabilities to the assembled command structure of Japan's Pacific forces. The briefing room, austere and precisely organized in the manner that characterized Japanese military culture, filled with the empire's most senior strategic minds as Tanaka methodically dismantled what he characterized as American logistical pretensions. The intelligence report, compiled through exhaustive analysis of American supply operations across North Africa and the early Pacific campaigns, presented what appeared to be irrefutable evidence of fundamental American weakness in the art of military logistics. Japanese military observers had documented American supply methods with meticulous precision, and their conclusions reinforced existing Japanese assumptions about American military incompetence in the sophisticated discipline of sustaining armies across vast distances. American logistics doctrine, the report emphasized, relied heavily on motor transport rather than the more efficient rail networks that formed the backbone of professional military supply systems. The Americans demonstrated alarming dependence on trucks, vehicles that Japanese planners considered wasteful of fuel, maintenance-intensive, vulnerable to interdiction, and fundamentally unsuited for the distances and terrain challenges that characterized Pacific warfare. Where Japanese forces utilized carefully planned rail networks supplemented by coastal shipping and pack animals adapted to local conditions, Americans apparently believed they could simply drive trucks across any terrain and somehow maintain supply flow through brute force application of vehicles and fuel. The intelligence assessment documented specific American logistical failures that supported Japanese conclusions. In North Africa, American supply lines had stretched dangerously thin during pursuit operations, with entire units grinding to halt for lack of fuel and ammunition despite operating relatively close to established ports. In New Guinea, American forces had required months to build up supplies for operations that Japanese units would have executed immediately with lighter logistical footprints. American units consumed supplies at rates that Japanese planners found almost incomprehensible, requiring 5 to 10 times the daily tonnage per soldier that Japanese forces needed, revealing what Japanese analysts characterized as fundamental inefficiency born from soft living and poor discipline. Japanese military culture prided itself on logistical efficiency achieved through careful planning, minimal consumption, and soldiers conditioned to function on reduced rations that would incapacitate American forces. Japanese soldiers carried their own supplies, marched vast distances without vehicle support, and operated effectively on supply levels that American units would consider starvation conditions. This capability, refined through decades of operations in China and Southeast Asia, represented what Japanese commanders considered professional military competence, the ability to sustain combat operations without the massive supply apparatus that Americans apparently required. The intelligence report specifically analyzed American motor transport capabilities with dismissive precision. American trucks, while mechanically reliable by crude standards, lacked the fuel efficiency of Japanese vehicles. American drivers, predominantly civilian volunteers with minimal military training, demonstrated poor discipline compared to professional Japanese transport units. American maintenance procedures required elaborate supply chains of spare parts, specialized tools, and trained mechanics, creating vulnerability that Japanese forces could exploit through interdiction of key choke points. Most critically, American dependence on petroleum-based fuel for virtually all transport created a strategic weakness that resource-poor Japan had learned to minimize through diverse transport methods including animal power, human porters, and coastal vessels that could operate without the massive fuel requirements American methods demanded. General Tanaka emphasized the mathematical realities that shaped Japanese confidence. American supply requirements per division exceeded Japanese requirements by factors that made sustained American offensive operations logistically impossible across Pacific distances. An American infantry division required approximately 800 tons of supplies daily during active operations, including fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. A comparable Japanese division operated effectively on 80 to 100 tons daily, achieving combat effectiveness through superior discipline, careful resource management, and soldiers trained to function under conditions that would break American morale. The distances involved in Pacific warfare made these consumption differentials decisive in Japanese strategic planning. From established American bases in Hawaii or Australia to potential invasion targets across the central or southwest Pacific stretched thousands of miles of ocean with minimal intermediate bases. Sustaining American units across such distances while maintaining the supply levels Americans apparently required would demand shipping tonnage, port facilities, and supply infrastructure that Japan's intelligence assessments indicated America could not possibly construct or maintain during active combat operations. Japanese planners possessed accurate data about American shipping construction and port development capabilities as of mid-1943. American merchant ship production, while impressive by pre-war standards, remained insufficient to support the massive supply requirements that American tactical doctrine demanded while simultaneously supporting Britain, sustaining Soviet Russia through Lend-Lease, and maintaining civilian consumption at levels Japanese citizens would consider obscenely wasteful. American port construction in the Pacific proceeded slowly, hampered by labor shortages, equipment limitations, and the massive infrastructure requirements that American supply methods necessitated. The strategic implications seemed clear to Japanese military leadership. American offensive operations would be constrained by logistical realities that Japanese forces had learned to transcend through superior military culture and operational efficiency. American advances would necessarily proceed slowly, requiring months of supply buildup before each operation, giving Japanese forces ample time to prepare defenses and counterattack supply lines. American units, once separated from their elaborate supply infrastructure by aggressive Japanese interdiction, would quickly become combat ineffective as soldiers accustomed to abundance faced shortages they lacked training or temperament to endure. General Tanaka's presentation reinforced strategic assumptions that shaped Japanese defensive planning across the Pacific. Japan would trade space for time, forcing Americans to extend supply lines across vast distances while Japanese forces operating on interior lines with minimal supply requirements could shift forces rapidly to threatened sectors. American logistics would become the rope that strangled American strategic ambitions as the tonnage requirements for sustaining offensives overwhelmed American shipping capacity and port infrastructure. Japanese submarine and air forces would target the vulnerable American supply network, sinking the ungainly cargo ships that American operations absolutely required, cutting supply lines that Americans lacked the flexibility or discipline to work around through alternative methods. The assembled Japanese commanders received Tanaka's assessment with grave satisfaction. The analysis confirmed their understanding of American weakness and validated the strategic approach Japan had adopted for protracted Pacific defense. Americans might possess material abundance, but they lacked the logistical sophistication and operational flexibility that professional military forces required for sustained operations across oceanic distances. American soldiers, soft and undisciplined, would wilt when their accustomed supply abundance failed to materialize. American commanders, trained in European-style warfare with established rail networks and short supply lines, would prove incapable of adapting to Pacific realities where professional logistics separated victors from defeated. What Japanese military intelligence failed to comprehend, despite their meticulous data collection and analysis, was that 7,000 miles away, an organizational revolution in military logistics was taking shape that would render every Japanese assumption obsolete within months. The American approach to supply that Japanese planners dismissed as primitive and inefficient would prove devastatingly effective precisely because it rejected the constraints and assumptions that limited Japanese logistical thinking. The motor transport capability that Japanese intelligence mocked would become the instrument that delivered tonnage at rates Japanese planners considered mathematically impossible, sustaining American offensives that advanced faster than Japanese forces could redeploy to meet them. The fundamental miscalculation embedded in Japanese analysis stemmed from measuring American potential against Japanese methods and assuming American limitations mirrored Japanese constraints. Japanese logistics achieved efficiency through scarcity, training soldiers to function on minimal supplies and accepting the operational limitations this imposed. American logistics would achieve overwhelming effectiveness through abundance, building supply systems that delivered such massive tonnage that operational constraints simply ceased to exist. Japanese forces conserved supplies because they lacked alternatives. American forces would consume supplies freely because their logistics system could deliver effectively unlimited quantities. Japanese intelligence officers had compiled accurate data about American vehicle production, port construction rates, and shipping tonnage. What they could not measure or comprehend was American organizational capability to improvise supply solutions that ignored established military doctrine in favor of whatever methods actually worked. They could not conceptualize an army that would strip away traditional military hierarchy in logistics operations, placing 19-year-old sergeants in command of convoys moving millions of dollars in supplies with minimal supervision because the sergeants delivered results while traditional command structures would have collapsed under the operational tempo American advances demanded. Most critically, Japanese military culture prevented understanding that American logistical strength emerged precisely from the factors Japanese analysis identified as weaknesses. American reliance on motor transport, seemingly inefficient and vulnerable, provided flexibility that rail-bound Japanese logistics could never achieve. American supply abundance, apparently wasteful, eliminated the careful rationing and priority systems that slowed Japanese operations. American use of minimally trained civilian drivers, supposedly demonstrating poor military discipline, actually proved superior to professional Japanese transport units because civilian truckers understood vehicle maintenance and improvisation in ways military training never taught. The intelligence assessment that General Tanaka presented in August 1943 would be systematically demolished by reality within 6 months as American forces launched offensives across the Central and Southwest Pacific that advanced at speeds Japanese planning had deemed logistically impossible. The Red Ball Express concept, not yet formalized by name but already taking shape in American logistics operations, would prove that American trucks driven by American soldiers could sustain offensive operations across distances and terrain that Japanese planners had calculated would break any supply system. American logistics doctrine as of mid-1943 remained evolutionary and improvisational rather than rigidly codified. American commanders in North Africa and the Pacific had discovered through painful experience that European-style logistics planning failed in theaters lacking established infrastructure. They had learned that traditional military supply procedures, with their elaborate requisition systems and hierarchical approval processes, could not match the operational tempo that American tactical mobility demanded. In response, American logistics officers at every level were developing new methods that emphasized results over procedures, delivery over documentation, and improvisation over adherence to doctrine. The motor transport companies that Japanese intelligence dismissed as inefficient and undisciplined were in reality becoming extraordinarily capable organizations that achieved supply delivery rates peacetime planning had never anticipated. American truck drivers, many recruited directly from civilian trucking companies where they had learned to maintain vehicles and navigate routes under commercial pressures that military training never simulated, brought practical competence that formal military logistics education could not replicate. They understood that trucks were tools for moving cargo rather than military equipment to be maintained according to regulation, and this pragmatic attitude translated directly into higher operational availability and better performance under field conditions. American logisticians were discovering that the massive fuel consumption Japanese planners identified as a critical weakness actually represented a decisive advantage once fuel supply could be assured. Trucks consumed fuel voraciously compared to animal transport or human porters, but they moved tonnage at rates and across distances that made the fuel expenditure trivial in comparison to delivery capability achieved. A single truck company could move more supplies in one day than a Japanese pack animal company could transport in a week, and could do so across terrain and distances where animal transport would simply fail. The fuel required to sustain American motor transport, while substantial, represented a tiny fraction of the total tonnage American trucks delivered, making fuel consumption a negligible constraint once petroleum supply infrastructure existed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. American engineers were simultaneously revolutionizing port construction and fuel distribution in ways that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated because Japanese military culture could not conceive of the engineering approaches Americans were developing. American construction battalions, the Seabees, were building port facilities in weeks that conventional military engineering would require months to complete, using improvised methods and equipment that military engineering manuals never mentioned because peacetime military engineers had never faced requirements for such rapid construction under combat conditions. They were laying fuel pipelines across islands to eliminate the truck transport Japanese planners assumed would be required, creating distribution networks that delivered petroleum products directly to supply dumps with minimal vehicle requirements. The supply buildup occurring across American Pacific bases in the latter half of 1943 represented logistics operations on a scale Japanese intelligence could observe but apparently could not analyze accurately. American cargo vessels were arriving at forward bases with regularity that suggested supply abundance rather than the careful allocation Japanese planning required. American supply dumps were growing to sizes that Japanese logistics doctrine would consider dangerous concentration of resources, yet American forces maintained these stocks without apparent concern for the vulnerability Japanese commanders would exploit through air attack. The sheer physical volume of American supplies accumulating at bases like Milne Bay, Guadalcanal, and Espiritu Santo exceeded Japanese base supply levels by orders of magnitude, representing either reckless waste or capabilities that Japanese analysis had fundamentally underestimated. By late 1943, fragmentary intelligence reports reaching Tokyo suggested American supply operations were achieving results that contradicted Japanese assessments, but these reports were generally dismissed as exaggerations or misinterpretations by observers unfamiliar with professional logistics analysis. Reports of American truck convoys moving hundreds of vehicles daily were discounted because Japanese planners calculated that fuel consumption alone would make such operations unsustainable. Claims that American forward bases were receiving thousands of tons of supplies weekly were rejected as propaganda because Japanese analysts determined that shipping tonnage required for such delivery rates exceeded available American cargo capacity in the Pacific theater. The institutional momentum of Japanese strategic planning, built on assumptions validated by decades of successful operations in Asia, prevented serious reconsideration of American logistics capabilities even as evidence accumulated that American supply methods were achieving unprecedented results. Japanese military culture valued careful planning based on established doctrine, and the doctrine clearly demonstrated that American logistics approaches were fundamentally flawed and would fail under the pressures of sustained combat operations across Pacific distances. The evidence suggesting otherwise must therefore reflect American propaganda, observer error, or temporary conditions that would not persist once Japanese forces applied sustained pressure against vulnerable American supply networks. What Japanese planners could not see, because their analytical framework prevented recognition, was that American logistics was succeeding precisely by rejecting the doctrinal constraints that Japanese analysis assumed were inviolable. American supply officers were inventing new procedures daily, discarding methods that failed and adopting whatever approaches actually delivered cargo regardless of whether those methods appeared in any logistics manual. American truck companies were operating vehicles at utilization rates that peacetime maintenance doctrine declared unsustainable, yet were achieving those rates sustainably by pragmatic maintenance that kept trucks running rather than maintaining them to regulation standards. American supply personnel at every level were making decisions that military hierarchy theoretically reserved for senior officers, yet this apparent breakdown of discipline was actually producing faster, more effective supply distribution than rigid command structures could achieve. The stage was set for a collision between Japanese assumptions and American reality that would demonstrate logistics capability as a decisive weapon of warfare. Japanese forces prepared defenses across the Pacific based on calculations that American supply limitations would constrain American offensives to predictable patterns Japanese commanders could counter. American forces were preparing offensives supported by logistics operations that would deliver supplies at rates Japanese planning had determined were impossible, enabling American advances at speeds and across distances that would shatter Japanese defensive calculations. The Red Ball Express, as the concept would eventually be formalized and named, represented the culmination of American logistical innovation that rejected established military wisdom in favor of pragmatic effectiveness. The system would prove that truck convoys, properly organized and ruthlessly focused on delivery rather than military formality, could sustain offensive operations that advanced faster than defending forces could react. The system would demonstrate that minimally trained drivers given clear objectives and authority to achieve them could outperform elaborately organized military transport units constrained by doctrine and hierarchy. Most devastating to Japanese strategic planning, the system would prove that American logistics could deliver such supply abundance that tactical and operational constraints simply ceased to exist, enabling American forces to attack wherever and whenever commanders chose without the careful build-up periods that Japanese planning assumed were militarily necessary. The Japanese generals who laughed at American logistics in August 1943 would find their strategic assumptions systematically demolished within 6 months as American forces, sustained by supply operations Japanese analysis had determined were impossible, advanced across the Pacific at rates that made Japanese defensive redeployment futile. The motor transport system they dismissed as primitive would prove sophisticated precisely through its rejection of sophistication in favor of brutal effectiveness. The American drivers they scorned as undisciplined would demonstrate discipline of the highest order, the discipline of achieving mission objectives regardless of obstacles, while Japanese forces constrained by traditional military discipline found their operational options progressively eliminated by an enemy whose logistics made them effectively unstoppable. The fundamental lesson that Japanese military leadership would learn too late to alter strategic outcomes was that logistics victory belonged not to forces that consumed least, but to forces that could deliver most. Japanese efficiency in operating on minimal supplies, a source of justified pride, became irrelevant when facing an enemy whose supply system could deliver effectively unlimited quantities. Japanese logistical sophistication, refined through decades of professional military development, proved inferior to American pragmatic improvisation that cared only about results. Japanese strategic planning built on assumptions about American limitations would collapse because those assumptions measured American potential through Japanese constraints, failing to recognize that American logistics was building capability unconstrained by the limitations Japanese planners assumed were universal to all military forces. The story of how American logistics, and specifically the Red Ball Express concept, demolished Japanese strategic planning reveals timeless lessons about the dangers of measuring others by your own limitations, the power of pragmatic innovation over doctrinal sophistication, and the reality that in warfare as in all competitive endeavors, victory belongs to those who can sustain effort rather than those who can endure scarcity. What follows in the second part of this account documents how American truck drivers, mechanics, and supply officers transformed theoretical impossibility into operational reality, delivering victory through methods that military professionals initially dismissed but which proved devastatingly effective precisely because they ignored professional wisdom in favor of whatever actually worked. February 1944. The Central Pacific Offensive had transformed from theoretical planning into operational reality, and with it came logistics challenges that would have paralyzed conventional military thinking. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Campaign and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive were advancing simultaneously across thousands of miles of ocean, each requiring supply tonnage that exceeded the total logistics capacity of most nations' entire military forces. Japanese strategic planning had calculated that American forces would need to pause for months between operations to accumulate supplies, yet American units were advancing continuously, supplied by convoy systems that delivered cargo at rates Japanese intelligence continued to dismiss as statistically impossible even as evidence mounted that the impossible was occurring daily. The Red Ball Express, though not yet carrying that specific designation in early 1944, had evolved from improvised necessity into systematic doctrine through hard lessons learned across North Africa, Sicily, and the early Pacific campaigns. American logistics officers had discovered that traditional military supply procedures could not match the operational tempo that American tactical mobility and firepower enabled. Units equipped with reliable vehicles, abundant fuel, and overwhelming firepower could advance faster than supply systems designed around peacetime assumptions could sustain. The solution emerging from field experience rejected military hierarchy in favor of whatever methods actually delivered cargo to forward units before those units outran their supply lines. The transformation began with fundamental reconception of what military logistics could achieve. Traditional doctrine, developed when armies moved at the speed of marching infantry and horse-drawn wagons, assumed that supply operations required careful planning, formal requisition procedures, and hierarchical approval processes. Supplies moved through established echelons from theater-level depots to army-level warehouses to division supply points to regimental dumps to battalion trains to company areas. Each transfer required documentation, inspection, and formal handoff between responsible officers. The system worked adequately when armies advanced slowly and predictably, giving supply officers time to process paperwork and coordinate movements through proper channels. American forces in 1944 were not advancing slowly or predictably. Armored spearheads supported by motorized infantry could penetrate 50 miles in a day when facing broken opposition, leaving supply units scrambling to catch up. Artillery battalions could fire thousands of shells in hours during preparation bombardments, consuming ammunition faster than formal requisition procedures could replenish stocks. Engineers building airfields and roads needed construction materials delivered immediately, not after supply officers processed requests through bureaucratic channels. The operational tempo that American firepower and mobility enabled simply could not be sustained through traditional logistics methods. The solution that emerged was revolutionary in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Eliminate the intermediate steps. Load trucks at supply dumps, drive those trucks directly to forward units, unload cargo, and return for more. Remove formal requisitions, hierarchical approvals, and documentation requirements. Give truck company commanders authority to move whatever cargo forward units needed without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Measure success not by adherence to procedures but by tonnage delivered and operational units sustained. Trust sergeants and lieutenants to make decisions that peacetime doctrine reserved for colonels and generals. The concept violated every principle of military logistics as taught in staff schools and codified in field manuals. It created apparent chaos where doctrine demanded order. It granted authority to junior personnel that military hierarchy reserved for senior officers. It eliminated accountability measures that peacetime administration considered essential. It substituted pragmatic effectiveness for procedural correctness. Military professionals trained in traditional methods initially resisted the approach as dangerous deviation from proven doctrine that would inevitably produce disaster. The approach worked beyond any projection because it matched methods to mission rather than subordinating mission to methods. Truck drivers who understood their job was delivering cargo found ways to deliver cargo regardless of obstacles that would have stopped operations conducted according to regulation. Supply sergeants who could load trucks based on what forward units needed rather than what paperwork authorized could respond to changing tactical situations faster than formal requisition systems could process requests. Company commanders who could dispatch convoys based on operational necessity rather than scheduled deliveries could sustain advances that would have stalled waiting for supplies if traditional procedures had governed operations. The personnel who made the system work came predominantly from backgrounds that military planners had initially considered unsuitable for professional logistics operations. Civilian truck drivers who had worked for commercial freight companies brought practical knowledge of vehicle maintenance and long-distance driving that military training programs could not replicate. Young men from rural areas who had grown up operating farm equipment possessed mechanical understanding that formal automotive schools taught theoretically, but these men knew instinctively. Workers from construction and mining industries understood heavy equipment and improvised repairs with available materials rather than waiting for proper spare parts that might not arrive for weeks. Japanese intelligence assessment had identified American reliance on minimally trained civilian personnel as a critical weakness that would manifest under combat pressures. The assessment proved exactly backward. Civilian drivers proved superior to formally trained military transport personnel precisely because civilian experience had taught them to solve problems pragmatically rather than by reference to regulations. A civilian trucker who had kept vehicles running through Depression-era poverty with improvised repairs and salvaged parts brought capabilities that military mechanics trained to work by technical manuals could not match. Men who had driven commercial routes under pressure to deliver on schedule understood that mission accomplishment mattered more than procedural compliance. The trucks themselves represented American industrial capability applied to military requirements with overwhelming effect. The GMC CCKW 6x6 cargo truck, mass-produced in quantities that Japanese vehicle manufacturing could not approach, became the foundation of American logistics mobility. Each truck could carry 5 tons of cargo across terrain that would stop conventional vehicles, powered by reliable engines that required minimal specialized maintenance, equipped with standardized parts that made field repairs straightforward even for mechanics with limited formal training. American factories were producing these vehicles at rates exceeding 1,500 weekly by mid-1943, replacing losses and expanding capability simultaneously. Japanese military planners had calculated vehicle production rates accurately but had failed to grasp the implications of American manufacturing scale. Japan produced approximately 20,000 military trucks total during the entire war. The United States produced over 800,000 trucks of all types, with the CCKW alone accounting for more than 500,000 vehicles. The numerical disparity meant that American forces could absorb vehicle losses that would cripple Japanese operations, could dedicate trucks to specific supply routes without affecting other operations, and could maintain such vehicle density that breakdown of individual trucks created no operational impact because replacement vehicles were always immediately available. The fuel required to sustain American motor transport operations represented consumption that Japanese logistics systems considered prohibitively wasteful. A single American truck company operating 100 vehicles consumed approximately 2,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for vehicle operations, not counting fuel for generators, equipment, and heating. Japanese military planning doctrine would have rejected such consumption as unsustainable extravagance. American logistics planning treated fuel as effectively unlimited once supply infrastructure existed, and proceeded to build that infrastructure with characteristic engineering overwhelming of obstacles. American petroleum engineers developed fuel distribution systems that delivered gasoline and diesel to forward areas with efficiency that eliminated the transport bottlenecks Japanese planners had assumed would constrain American operations. Instead of relying solely on truck transport of fuel in drums and jerrycans, American engineers laid pipelines across islands and through jungle terrain, delivering petroleum products directly to supply points where trucks could refuel without creating additional transport requirements. The pipelines, constructed with the same mass-produced standardized components that characterized all American logistics infrastructure, could be installed rapidly by engineer units and extended as operations advanced, creating fuel distribution capability that scaled with operational requirements. The supply dumps that fed the truck convoys represented accumulation of material on scales that Japanese logistics doctrine considered dangerous concentration of resources. American forward supply bases routinely held 50 to 100,000 tons of supplies, creating targets that Japanese planners assumed would be highly vulnerable to air attack or naval bombardment. American forces accepted the apparent risk because the supply abundance enabled operational freedom that conservative supply management could never achieve. Units could be committed to combat knowing that ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies existed in quantities sufficient for sustained operations regardless of how consumption rates fluctuated during actual fighting. Japanese forces operating on carefully rationed supplies necessarily conserved resources, limiting artillery expenditure to avoid running short during critical battles, restricting patrol activity to preserve fuel for essential movements, carefully managing food stocks to prevent shortages during extended operations. These conservation measures, militarily prudent given Japanese supply limitations, created tactical and operational constraints that reduced combat effectiveness. American units facing no such constraints could fire artillery preparatory bombardments that consumed more ammunition in hours than Japanese divisions were allocated for months, could conduct aggressive patrolling that wore down enemy forces through constant pressure, could maintain operations indefinitely because supply abundance eliminated the resource management decisions that constrained Japanese operational planning. The convoy operations that sustained American advances operated with organizational efficiency that belied their apparent simplicity. A typical Red Ball Express convoy consisted of 100 to 300 trucks traveling in close formation along routes dedicated exclusively to supply traffic. Each truck carried 5 tons of cargo loaded according to priority systems that ensured forward units received critical supplies first while less urgent material followed in subsequent convoys. The trucks traveled at sustained speeds of 30 miles per hour on improved roads, covering 200 to 300 miles daily on routes that operated continuously with convoys departing supply dumps every few hours. The operational tempo required for such convoy operations exceeded what traditional military transport doctrine considered sustainable. Drivers worked 18 to 20-hour days during critical operations, sleeping beside their trucks during brief rest periods before driving another convoy run. Vehicles operated at utilization rates that peacetime maintenance planning declared would cause rapid mechanical failure, yet were sustained through pragmatic maintenance that kept trucks running rather than maintaining them to peacetime standards. Supply officers made loading decisions in minutes that formal procedures would have required hours to authorize through proper channels. The entire system operated with organized urgency that achieved results traditional military efficiency could not match. Japanese intelligence monitoring American supply operations through aerial reconnaissance and agent reports continued to submit assessments claiming American logistics were unsustainable and would collapse under sustained pressure. The assessments reflected inability to comprehend that American methods had transcended the constraints that Japanese analysis assumed were universal to all military logistics. Japanese planners calculated truck maintenance requirements based on Japanese vehicle reliability and spare parts availability, not recognizing that American trucks were more reliable and that American supply systems ensured spare parts availability that Japanese logistics could not achieve. They projected fuel consumption sustainability based on Japanese petroleum access, failing to account for American fuel production and distribution capability that operated without the constraints Japanese forces faced. The ultimate demonstration of American logistics capability came during the Philippines campaign beginning in October 1944. MacArthur's return to the Philippines required sustained supply operations across distances and in conditions that Japanese strategic planning had determined would make American offensive operations impossible to sustain. The invasion of Leyte required delivering 100,000 tons of supplies monthly to support operations on an island with minimal port facilities and limited road networks. Japanese defensive planning assumed that American forces would be constrained by logistics limitations, requiring months to build up supplies before advancing beyond initial beachheads. American logistics operations demolished these assumptions within weeks. Engineer units transformed beaches into functioning ports within days of initial landings, unloading cargo directly from landing craft while construction battalions built piers and roads. Truck convoys began operating immediately, moving supplies from beach dumps to forward units faster than those units could consume them despite aggressive tactical operations. Within 30 days of the initial landings, American forces on Leyte were receiving supply tonnage that exceeded Japanese projections by factors of 3 to 5, enabling operational tempo that Japanese defensive planning had not anticipated as possible. The Red Ball Express concept reached full implementation during the Leyte campaign with dedicated truck routes operating around the clock to sustain advancing American units. Convoys moved through rain and mud that would have stopped conventional transport operations, with drivers winching trucks through impossible terrain and repairing vehicles under conditions that military maintenance doctrine declared prohibited effective work. The tonnage delivered exceeded every projection, not through adherence to planning but through determination of personnel who understood that forward units depended on supplies getting through regardless of obstacles or difficulties encountered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.